I mean, my concluding comment was, Lizzie, no one can do the dichotomy that you, the human, needs them to. They can't love you and serve Elizabeth Regina at the same time. Hey, y'all, we're the Good Doctors of Abbey Research. I'm Dr. Kristen.
And I'm Dr. Erin.
And you are so welcome to our corner of the internet for this conversation about Netflix's The Crown, Season 5, Episode 6, entitled Ipatayev House. I think that's how we say it. Ipatayev House.
Yeah, I don't speak Russian, so I don't know.
Yeah. Which is entirely about Boris Yeltsin and 1994 and the fact that Elizabeth was the first Western monarch to ever go to Russia. And this belief from her that I have literally never heard since, that there's some sort of relationship between Russia and Britain. I thought I was listening to Tony Blair talk about the special relationship between America and the U.S. It was all very strange. This was also a marriage episode that I think younger Kristen would have been very annoyed by. Like 20s Kristen would have been annoyed. Like, we already talked about all this. But older Kristen is like, it's still fascinating that they are still having these conversations because neither one of them is listening to the other person.
Yeah, and it's like, it was fascinating to see, I think, and you know, we will probably talk about this in our full season recap, but like, the longer you and I talk about this season and the more episodes we get into it, Rando episode 3 aside, this season feels a lot more settled in itself than maybe season 4, or maybe this cast does. I'm not quite sure. I haven't quite worked out my feelings about it, but it feels more natural for them to be having these kind of like, where are we now conversations at this stage in, you know, Lizzie and Philip's life. And I don't know, more lived in. Like, I think after you're married to someone for 40 years, 45 years, whatever they're on, you have very definite understandings of what your marriage is, and they're probably different. And, you know, I was interested about this, like, juxtaposition always of Philip and Elizabeth's personalities, and how she just wanted to have a horse farm in the country.
That's all she wanted. Bless her cotton socks.
A quiet life in the country, but she did fall in love with Philip, and like, he has always wanted this like adventure and you know, constant change and all of this. And so it was fascinating to see kind of how they do and don't make it work, and how they both had very different understandings of what marriage was supposed to be, and how lonely it can be for both of them to be in this marriage that there is no out from. Nor do I think they want to be out of it, but also kind of stuck with, you know, at the end of the day, I'm still me and you're still you. And like, yeah, so I like, all of that stuff was interesting to me. I think the fact that like, the actual fact that Philip's DNA helped figure out, like, identify the Romanovs' bodies is a fascinating piece of history. And like,
yes.
A story that, like, I, you know, found interesting before this show. And we should say our monarch moment for our patrons who are joining us. We'll be literally talking about our large cultural global obsession with the Romanov family and what happened to them, and the
The Princess
alleged
Anastasia.
the alleged stories and rumors and myths about the Grand Duchess Anastasia, one of the Tsars and Tsarina's daughters. So that'll be over on our Patreon. If you would like to join our Patreon, links below. All that applies. But yeah, I was worried when we started this episode in like 1917. And I was like, oh Lord, not another bottle episode that doesn't make any sense. Because again, when are we going to talk about the Althayats? Like, where is Dodi? I'm going to do like a Shelley Miscavige on this with much less stakes. But like, where is Dodi Fayad in this season? Y'all, like, why? Why did we do that bottle episode so early? You want to do it. You want the context. Great. Like, do that episode and then they meet and
introduce
then
us to Dodi. I know. It's so...
And then their relationship. And then, like, I was like, oh, maybe we're going to get it. And then she falls in love, like, in the next episode, she falls in love with this, like, Pakistani British doctor. I was like, what is happening? But I thought it was going to be another bottle episode, but I think they wove it in really interesting. And, like, the incestual relationship between royal families is always interesting, too. So, yeah. You know, do I need to know some of this stuff about Philip? Did it tell me anything new about Philip that we didn't already know? No. But yeah, an interesting part of history, and I think part of their relationship, whether it's actual, factual, or fiction, I don't know, but...
So, Too Long Didn't Read, the basic of this episode is that there is the end of the Cold War is upon us, as I said at the beginning. And so, therefore, we now have to deal with Russia and not the Soviet Union. Have to deal with Russia as diplomats and as statesmen and as everything else. And so, Boris Yeltsin, I know we are also used to talking about Boris Johnson these days. There was a former Boris in international politics. Boris Yeltsin, the first democratically elected leader of the landmass that is Russia.
Russian Federation.
Yeah, of what, and possibly the last, but that's a separate conversation. Is telling people he was an Anglophile. I don't know a ton about Boris Yeltsin. But even just from like the not translated comments in this one, that felt political and not authoritative and like not actual. But he plays Elizabeth like a fiddle, and arranges a mutual state visit. I remember from the early 90s, I was, but a child, but I was already a international diplomacy nerd. And I remember people talking about Boris as like the dawning of democracy in like the Russian bear was awaking. And I have a lot of questions now. I also can't overstate for anyone who was not like cognizant at the fall of the Soviet Union, the absolute like Western delight that communism was dead. Mm-hmm. And like the delight. And in the United States, that was fed a lot by the Christian right, because communism is very anti-established religion, as obviously. And so the early 90s, like 88 to 92, we have a conservative president who was not necessarily a Christian nationalist, but from 80 to 88, we certainly had a Christian nationalist. And 88 to 92, we had a little bit of a hiccup. And then we get a Christian nationalist again from 2000 and to 2008 in George W. Bush. Not H.W. was a little bit... H.W. had his own drama going on.
Yeah.
He just wasn't an outright Christian nationalist in the way that Reagan and his son were. And so I say that and I bring that phrase up because that is very important to understand why we needed Russia to be Western. And when we look now, 25, 35, 40 years, down the pike here, Russia did not ever appear to have an interest in being so. It just wanted to get along. Russia seems to now, especially still, Putin wants to be the Soviet Union, but they have a weird relationship with their state church. Like, Russian Orthodoxy exists. They're not outright killing Christians anymore, which, two thumbs way up. During the Cold War, there was a lot of outright persecution and murder. Like, they steamrolled human beings. Like, I mean, it was a problem. I'm not a alarmist, but it was a problem. Also, and since the fall of Russia, we've seen China really dial back on its communism. And so, again, a lot of people that are, a lot of Christian nationalists or conservatives in the United States see this as a victory for the church more than anything. So I found that very interesting, that one of the things that Philip fixated on in this episode was that he was born Orthodox and he was not born Church of England, and he converted for her. So he was born Greek Orthodox, and Russian Orthodox are not as identical as he implies in this script, because my guess is that Peter Morgan doesn't know that there is a difference. It's entirely possible.
And that he didn't want to get into the weeds of, like, the different,
which is
differences.
fine. There's maybe 45 people that watch The Crown that would have loved an entire, like,
deep dive.
So what was Philip's childhood baptism like? And I would have loved that. But again, 45 people. It's not enough. But it does also, I think I say all of this because it reminded me that Philip was always a weird fit with Elizabeth.
Yeah.
It was all, even if she had just been the, like, even if she had been the, like, Eugenie of her generation, he would have been a weird fit.
Yeah.
And, like, he has very, very strong opinions of what masculinity is, which, like, isn't necessarily even that British, to be honest. Like,
yeah, I think
it's almost Russian, to be, like, looking back, and the military obsession, of course it exists in Britain, but, like, not the way that we are led to believe Philip believes it is. That was messy.
Yeah. No. But I understand what you're saying, and I think it's a really interesting point that, like, we often forget, and the royal family wants us to forget.
Oh, they desperately want us to.
That he is not culturally British, like, at his core. And all of his, like, we talked about this a lot in season 1 with our beloved Maddie Smith, doing a lot of heavy lifting about, like, the psychology of a young Philip, and, like, the impact of being, fleeing his whole young childhood. They fled Greece. His family was murdered in Russia, like, all, and, like, kind of the way, as he says in this episode, the way his ancestors were treated, really, really impacted his adolescence, obviously, and then how that impacted how he saw himself as a human being, and he kind of, like, froze emotionally with a lot of that stuff. But yeah, I think this was a great reminder that he is, the image of him as culturally British is an image. And there's a lot more Greek and Russian in him than the firm ever wanted to admit. Not to say he wasn't British, he didn't become British, like, whatever. But, like, I find this exploration of his layers very interesting, if not slightly repetitive.
Yeah, and I think, and I should, in full disclosure, like, my husband and I are coming up in about a month on our 10th wedding anniversary, and we have been talking a lot in our personal lives in the last couple weeks about what marriage is, what we both thought marriage was going to be, what we thought marriage was going to be to each other. We did not have a very romantic proposal or wedding process. It was very procedural and due to immigration. And so we didn't have a lot of those conversations when we talked about why we wanted, like, when we were getting married, we didn't have a lot of those. And so 10 years in, we've been having them a lot more now. And I watched this episode, like, the day after one of those conversations with John, where we were talking about how, like, I told him some story. I can't remember. I think it was to do when I was a swimmer, like, some story about when I was swimming. And I know I told him this before because, like, I have a memory of how he responded. And he responded differently this time. And it was really, I just looked back, I was like, that's really interesting, because, like, last time you thought that was funny, and this time you don't think it's very funny. And he said, I know more layers of you now. And like I thought, and I know more layers of him now too. Like there are stories I remember his sisters telling me from their growing up years when we were dating that I thought were adorable, and now I'm like, oh, that was John telling you all he didn't like himself very much, that kind of thing. And so I think that really did affect my lens of my enjoyment of this episode, where I didn't find it repetitive because they know more layers of each other now.
That's a great way to put it. That's a great way to put it.
They've lived through so much. And I mean, my concluding comment was, Lizzie, no one can do the dichotomy that you, the human, needs them to. They can't love you and serve Elizabeth Regina at the same time. And
Very
so again,
hard.
being royal is a human rights violation. We quote Michael Hobbes every single conversation we have about this family. It's a human rights violation because Lizzie should have never been asked to ask people she loves to do that. And I have a feeling this marriage they thought they were going to have, she would have been perfectly content letting him sail around the world. And she would have done the farm and raised the kids. And the cheating would have still been terrible. Who knows if he would have done it if he got this fulfillment, if he didn't have the weird I'm not important thing. He could have created his own importance. Like, he is a man who needs to be important. And unfortunately, he married the one woman on the planet who means that there's no way he can ever be as important as she is.
As important, more important than her. Yeah, there
more
will
important
always
than
be
her.
There will always be one person more important and more significant. Yeah.
So who knows? I mean, her uncle abdicating is the butterfly effect of all of royal Western European royal history. Like that's a major butterfly effect. But I found it very fascinating that the conversation they had on the couch where he said, I am looking for companionship.
Yeah.
And she is not into that. And I explained this episode to John later, and he just said, I can't imagine that kind of marriage. And I said the same thing. I was like, I know people who are married to people they don't enjoy spending time with, and they have nothing in common with. I know those folks. That's not a life I would want for myself. And so I do understand where Philip is coming from here. Like, hey, I'm not mad. I'm not even, I need you to play along with this because this is how I'm going to live the life that we have found ourselves in.
Yeah.
And it was whiny and annoying, but it was also bizarrely pragmatic for our Philip. And like, I didn't appreciate how he communicated it. I didn't appreciate how he didn't invite her into anything. He was still Philip about it. He was still Philip. But I think overall, this is why I didn't find any of this repetitive.
Yeah.
Because, I think if we had gone down the rabbit hole and we had to hear, like in episode 7, I watched these in bracketed chunks, by the way, because I can't binge this series anymore. So I watched 6 and 7 together. And in 7, we're going to get a little bit about William going to Eton. Historically, that happens in the mid-90s. And if we had done this, like, divergence into the schooling of Charles again, no, I'm good, thanks. But, like, this revisiting wasn't, which we did not do. This revisiting wasn't abhorrent to me. However, I say all of that. I don't need Penny. I don't need any time with Penny. I didn't need an explanation of DNA sequencing. I didn't need that party where they talked. I didn't need any of that. And I didn't need Penny quasi-mansplaining Lizzie's family to her. And, like, I didn't need any of that.
I thought it was a distraction from... It was distracting. I thought Penny being in it was to the level that she was, and implying that Philip may or may not be having a physical relationship with her, and like all of that kind of stuff. Her weird, whether it was factual or not, I doubt it was, interpretation that the Tsarina and Queen Mary had this weird like rivalry, and that's why. Like,
I think it's possible they had their rivalry, but that's the motivation? No, I don't buy for a minute.
That was the motivation for Mary suggesting that her husband, like,
cousin should be
let his cousins be murdered. Like, that was like, a low blow.
Of course it's World War I. Of course you Muppet, it's World War I. Like,
yeah, and all of that, and like, I think this is a good transition into kind of the acting in this episode, because you and I talked offline before we started filming about how phenomenal Imelda Staunton was in this episode, in showing us vulnerability in Elizabeth that we got in parts from Olivia Colman, but I don't know, it hits differently with Imelda Staunton, because even as I'm saying it, like, we did get some really emotional moments and vulnerable moments from Olivia Colman, but maybe she didn't have the...
I don't think the storylines, because the stuff that is really arresting
storylines
with Imelda is the family stuff. And I think the only script that Olivia really got was the bottle up, like, we saw the was Aberfan, but then also when the dude broke in, like, we saw she did a lot of really good face work when the dude broke in, but she didn't get a lot of good family storylines because we were way too busy with Charles and Diana in those seasons.
Yeah, and she got all of her stuff with Charles was like lecturing him about like his investiture and like all of this kind of stuff, and it wasn't directed like at herself.
No, and this is a lot more like the sundowning of her career in a way. Yeah.
Allegedly. We know she stays in it for a lot longer. But yeah, I mean, I thought...
But there's a shift. When William becomes of age, I think there's a shift of like, oh... I mean, I think there's a lot of reasons why she didn't abdicate, including that she would have never done it because her uncle did it to her. Like, I think there's a lot of reasons. But she's different as a grandma than as a mom.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. As a leader, too. Like...
Yeah, and especially as a grandma and a leader to like young adults.
Yes.
Like,
thank you. That was you said it better than I did. Yeah.
Rather than to like children.
Yeah.
But as William has come of age, she definitely treats William very differently than she treated Charles. Poor Charles. Yeah, but I mean, I think she did a phenomenal job in this episode of being vulnerable with Philip, of showing how lonely it can be when you're in a marriage with two very different personalities with very different goals. I wrote down the tiny hand gestures that she did. So like walking away from Penny and kind of the way she like clenched her fists. And I was like, ooh, oh, I see you, Imelda. Okay, Dolores. She's shed the Dolores Umbridge vibes, I think, for me.
Yeah.
No longer...
By episode 6. Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah. And so I love the end of the episode with her playing with those flippin' corgis. Like, it was just like, and they get to this understanding that, like, a good marriage is letting people be themselves. And pushing people, but maybe not forcing them to change in a way that is going to damage the marriage. I don't know. I'm not married, so I can't really talk about it. But it was interesting to see that. And I thought Jonathan Pryce is still Jonathan Pryce, pretending to be Philip. I'm just not going to buy it. He's in a show that I'm currently watching now called Slow Horses. And I was just like, you're just too much Jonathan Pryce for me to believe you as...
Yeah.
As Philip, of all people, like as Philip.
Yeah.
But she's doing some work with Lizzie, and I'm here for it. I thought it was a very interesting episode, and aside from the Penny of it all, yeah,
I don't have a lot of complaints about this one.
No.
I can talk for a long time about Russia, obviously, with my diatribe there, and then the Grand Duchess Anastasia. Which Aaron and I will get into in the Monarch moment. I want you to know you will get both some sociological explanation and also some personal stories about our... we were at the exact right age when 20th Century Fox's cartoon Anastasia came out, who is now a Disney princess because it's been bought by Disney. We were at the exact right age for that movie. And so we'll talk about that. And we'll talk about the idea of a princess.
Yeah.
Which I don't think holds the international imagination the way it does anymore. Thank you, Diana, Kate, and Meghan. I think we have some different feelings about it. It would look a little bit differently now. Also, DNA sequencing is a thing. But yeah, next episode is we're back to Diana.
Speaking of princesses.
And here's my teaser for that, for joining us for the next episode or next week. I was very pro how this series was treating Diana until this episode.
Ooh. Ooh.
And I'm excited to get into it with you all.
So we will see you next on the playlist next week, or in next up if you're watching this from the future. Hello, into the future. For episode 7, No Man's Land, hop on over to the Patreon for the Monarch Moment. If you'd like to join us on the Patreon and you haven't already, links below for all those deets. We're going to be singing some Broadway Disney show tunes and talking about Anastasia, which you really don't want to miss because the two of us are at our best, really, when we're talking about Anastasia. So we'll see you guys then.